At a destination wedding in Greece, the groom's brother pulled me onto a balcony and whispered, "We have a tradition, one night of pure freedom before the rings are exchanged." The Mediterranean breeze carried the sound of laughter as he traced a finger along my wrist and murmured, "No one leaves here with regrets." My heart pounded as he leaned in, until a loud voice interrupted, "Except maybe you." I turned to see a face I thought I'd left thousands of miles away. I wasn't supposed to be there. This was his wedding. My ex's wedding. And yet, somehow, I had ended up on a balcony in Santorini, staring out at the dark waves below, while his brother whispered something dangerous in my ear. "We have a tradition," Liam murmured, his fingers tracing along the inside of my wrist. "One night of pure freedom before the rings are exchanged." I could hear the music from inside. Laughter. Glasses clinking. The hum of conversation. Liam leaned in closer. His breath was warm, his voice slow. "No one leaves here with regrets." My pulse pounded. I should have pulled away. I should have laughed it off, told him no. Instead, I just stood there, frozen. And then, a voice I hadn't heard in a year shattered the moment. "Except maybe you." My body locked up. I turned so fast I nearly tripped, my dress catching under my heels. And there he was. Mark. My ex. His gaze flicked between me and Liam. His jaw was tight. His expression was unreadable, but I knew that look. He was furious. I hadn't seen him since the night he packed his things and walked out of our apartment. Since the last words he had spoken to me were, "I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive you." And yet, here he was. Standing in a villa in Greece. At his own wedding. His bride's wedding. And suddenly, I realized, I wasn't supposed to be here. And he knew it. I had come as a favor to my best friend, Rachel. Her boyfriend was in the wedding party, and he was acting weird about bringing a +1. Rachel had begged me to come along for moral support. "It's a free trip. Just keep a low profile, and no one will care." Seemed simple enough. What I didn't know was that the groom, my ex, was the reason Rachel had been acting so strange the entire time. She knew. She had to. I felt like I was moving in slow motion. I looked past Mark, into the villa, at the sea of guests inside. And then I saw her. The bride. She was standing in the doorway, watching us. Her wedding dress clung to her frame, the veil pinned back from her face. I knew that face. It took my brain a second to catch up, to put the pieces together. And then it hit me. I had met her before. 2 years ago. At a coffee shop. She had been his coworker. I remembered the way she laughed at his jokes, the way she looked at him when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I had asked him about her once. "She has a crush," Mark had chuckled, brushing it off. "It's nothing. Nothing. Nothing." I felt like I was going to be sick. Mark was staring at me like he had seen a ghost. Liam looked between us, amused, like he had just realized he had stepped into something much bigger than he had planned. Mark stepped forward. His voice was low. Sharp. "You shouldn't be here." I let out a breathless laugh. I wasn't supposed to be. The air felt too thick, too heavy. I could feel Rachel watching me from inside. I could see the way her face had drained of color. I turned back to the bride. My mouth felt dry. "Did you know?" She hesitated. Then, finally, she nodded. Not at first. My pulse was pounding in my ears. But now she did. Now she knew exactly who I was. And she was still marrying him. The world tilted. For a second, all I could hear was the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. My vision tunneled on the bride, on her, in that white dress, standing in the glow of a wedding that wasn't mine, but had somehow swallowed me whole. Mark was stiff beside her, his fists clenched at his sides. Liam exhaled through his nose, amused. "This is interesting." I barely heard him. I needed air. I turned sharply, but before I could take a step, Mark caught my wrist. "Wait." His voice was low, strained. I yanked my arm free so fast it stung. I needed to get out. Now. But the moment I stepped into the villa, I felt eyes on me. People were starting to notice. The groomsmen whispering, some of the guests glancing over, sensing the tension. Rachel caught up to me near the bar. "Hey," she whispered, her voice urgent. I didn't think you'd actually run into him." I turned on her so fast she flinched. "You knew." She looked guilty. You knew." Rachel swallowed. I thought maybe it wouldn't matter. I thought you'd blend in." I let out a laugh, sharp and humorless. Blend in. At my ex's wedding. Before I could say another word, a woman's voice cut through the tension. Is everything okay? I turned. The bride. Up close, she was flawless. Not in an airbrushed way, but in a way that made me ache. Like she had been sculpted for this moment. For this life. The one I had barely escaped from. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something else. Like she wanted to explain. But what could she say? Sorry I stole your boyfriend? Sorry he left you in pieces for me? Or worse, sorry you never even knew. Because I hadn't. I had spent months grieving him, trying to understand what went wrong. And now, standing here, in this villa, under lights meant to celebrate them, I finally knew. I wasn't a mistake he regretted. I was a secret he had buried. And she had helped him do it. The weight of it all pressed down on my chest. The villa, the music, the soft glow of candles on white tablecloths, it was suffocating. I had to leave. I took a step back. I shouldn't be here. She didn't stop me. But Mark did. He was there again, blocking my path, his fingers twitching like he wanted to reach for me but thought better of it. His voice was low, meant just for me. You don't get to just walk away. I stared at him. You did. His jaw clenched. It's not the same. I exhaled sharply. Then explain it to me. He hesitated. And that was all I needed to know. I pushed past him. But before I could make it to the doors, a hand caught my arm. Not Mark's. Not Rachel's. Not even Liam's. The bride. Her fingers were ice cold against my skin. And when I turned, her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive. It was something worse. It was pity. I should have told you, she whispered. The ground beneath me disappeared. I froze. The bride's grip on my arm was light, almost hesitant, but her words hit like a slap. I should have told you. The room blurred. The music, the laughter, the clinking glasses, it all became background noise. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, drowning everything else out. I pulled my arm free. What the hell does that mean? She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she was debating something. Then she exhaled, and said, he told me you cheated. I sucked in a breath. A slow, awful realization spread through me like poison. He told her I cheated. That was the story he spun? That was the lie that excused him, that absolved him? My hands curled into fists at my sides. I turned to Mark, whose face had gone pale, his mouth tightening as if he knew exactly what was coming. You said I cheated? My voice came out sharp, cutting through the air between us. He didn't answer. Rachel's breath hitched beside me. Even Liam, who had been enjoying the drama, straightened slightly, sensing the shift in the room. I took a step closer, my body vibrating with fury. You left me, Mark. You packed your shit and walked out. And now you're telling people it was my fault? Mark finally looked at me. His jaw was tight. His nostrils flared. But he didn't deny it. The bride glanced between us, confusion flickering in her eyes. So, you didn't? I let out a breathless, bitter laugh. No. I didn't. I turned back to Mark, anger burning in my throat. Tell her the truth. Silence. And then, I had to, Mark muttered. You don't get it. I blinked. What? Mark let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. I had to tell her something, okay? She found out. She saw texts. And he hesitated. I panicked. I almost laughed. You panicked? My voice was shaking now. So instead of owning it, you threw me under the bus? You made me the villain? His silence was answer enough. The bride swallowed, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty on her face. Like maybe, just maybe, the ground beneath her wasn't as stable as she thought. But before she could say anything, Liam spoke up, his tone dripping with amusement. Wow. Gotta say, Mark, that's a bold move. Cheating on your fiancé, then rewriting history to make yourself the victim? He whistled. You really are a piece of work. I turned back to the bride. How long? I demanded. How long after he left me did you two get together? She hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, we were already together. The air left my lungs. Everything around me tilted. I had always suspected. I had always wondered if she had been there before the end, if she had been more than just a coworker with a harmless crush. But hearing it confirmed? It was worse than I ever imagined. For months, I had drowned in guilt, in self-doubt, wondering what I had done wrong, what I could have done differently. Meanwhile, they had been building a future together. I took a step back. You knew, I whispered, staring at Mark. When you left me, you already knew you were gonna end up with her. He looked away. And that's when I realized, he had never felt guilty. Not once. Because in his mind, I was the bad guy. He had rewritten history to make himself the victim, and he believed it. And worst of all, so had she. Until now. Because I could see it in her eyes, the cracks forming in the perfect picture she had built in her mind. The doubt creeping in. But before she could say anything else, someone screamed. The room fell silent. And then, from across the villa, a crash. Glass shattering. A chair toppling over. And a voice, sharp and furious, cutting through the air. You lying son of a bitch. Another woman. One I didn't recognize. But from the look on Mark's face, he did. The room froze. Heads turned. Conversations died. The woman who had screamed was standing near the entrance, her hands trembling, her face contorted with fury. A glass lay shattered at her feet, red wine pooling on the marble floor like blood. She was beautiful, in a sharp, striking way, tall, dark hair swept up, wearing a silky black dress that clung to her body like it had been painted on. But her expression was nothing but rage. And she was staring straight at Mark. My stomach dropped. Mark didn't move. He just stared at her, his face blank, like his brain was short-circuiting. The bride turned, eyes narrowing. Who is she? The woman let out a breathless, bitter laugh. Oh, you don't know? I figured you wouldn't. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor. Let me introduce myself. I'm Natalie. That name meant nothing to me. But judging by the way Mark flinched, it meant something to him. The bride turned to Mark. Who is she? She repeated, her voice deadly calm. Mark's mouth opened, but no words came out. So Natalie spoke for him. Oh, honey. Her voice was almost gentle, but her eyes were sharp as knives. I'm the woman your fiancé has been sleeping with for the last 6 months. The world tilted. Someone gasped. A murmur rippled through the guests. The villa, once filled with music and laughter, was now a pressure cooker, ready to explode. I turned to Mark. Waiting. Daring him to deny it. But he didn't. His lips pressed together, his face going pale. The bride let out a shaky breath. Tell me she's lying. Mark didn't. Her breath hitched. Mark. Silence. And that was enough. The bride's face crumbled. I had thought, for a moment, that she was different, that she had known what she was getting into, that she had chosen this. But now? Now she looked shattered. She wasn't the girl who had won. She was just another fool, like me. Rachel grabbed my arm, her voice barely a whisper. We should go. But I couldn't move. Because the bride wasn't looking at Mark anymore. She was looking at me. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of emotions too tangled to separate. And then, to my shock, she laughed. Not a happy laugh. A hollow, bitter one. I should have known, she said softly. Her voice wasn't directed at me. It was directed at herself. And then, without another word, she turned, and slapped Mark across the face. The crack of her palm hitting his cheek echoed through the villa. Gasps. A few scattered whispers. Someone muttered, holy shit. Mark stumbled back, blinking in shock, but the bride wasn't done. She shoved him, hard, in the chest. You coward. You pathetic, lying coward. Mark opened his mouth to defend himself, but she wasn't interested. I gave up everything for you, she whispered. I believed you. Her voice cracked. I trusted you. Mark finally found his voice. I don't. Her eyes were glassy with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She turned to Natalie. You can have him. And then, to me. For a moment, I thought she would scream at me, throw something, blame me for all of it. But instead, she just shook her head. I hated you, she admitted. For so long. I thought you were the villain. I thought you destroyed him. Her lips trembled. But you were just his first victim, weren't you? I swallowed the lump in my throat. I didn't know. I know, she whispered. And then, she walked away. Straight through the crowd, past the groomsmen, past the tables of stunned guests. She moved like she was in a dream, or a nightmare she had just woken up from. Mark didn't chase her. He just stood there. Silent. Still. Like he had finally realized he had lost. Rachel dragged me outside before I could think too hard about what had just happened. The night air was cool, the sound of the waves louder out here. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Rachel was watching me carefully. You okay? I let out a weak laugh. No, she exhaled, rubbing her temples. This is insane. It was. And yet. For the first time in a year, I felt light. Because it was over. The guilt. The wondering. The not knowing. It was over. Mark had spent so much time rewriting history, twisting the past to make himself look like the victim. But in the end, the truth had ripped through the seams of his perfect story. And I had been there to watch it unravel. Rachel nudged my shoulder. What now? I looked back at the villa, at the shattered pieces of Mark's lies, still settling in the air. Then, finally, I turned away. And I walked forward.